Now, how neurotransmitters influence. These are the main neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, and endorphins. Probably the best known in terms of scientifically understood neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, ACH. This enables muscle action, learning, and memory. We do a lot of study of it in how it affects Alzheimer's. It's very interesting. It is also released, acetylcholine is released at every junction between a motor neuron and a skeletal muscle. So it's extremely important in movement. And when acetylcholine is released to muscle cell receptors, the muscle contracts. If the transmission is blocked, say with anesthesia, the muscles can't contract and we are paralyzed. So it's really, really interesting. Some other ones that are important: dopamine. We see dopamine a lot with schizophrenia. Dopamine plays a part in Parkinson's disease. Serotonin affects mood, and it is often linked to things like depression. Norepinephrine can also, an undersupply of this can depress mood. We often think about norepinephrine as being involved with the fight or flight response. GABA is another important inhibitory neurotransmitter, and an undersupply can lead to tremors, insomnia, seizures. And then glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. And so there's some things, people that are sensitive to MSG, this has a glutamate in it, and so people will avoid MSG in Asian foods often. It's very interesting because it can bring on headaches in some people. Another one that is not listed here is endorphins. It was listed on the previous slide. Endorphins are natural painkillers. They lessen pain and they boost mood. And this is one of the reasons why we believe acupuncture is effective in pain killing as a painkiller, because it causes those little pins, those little needles actually cause endorphins to be released in the body. Now, what's interesting about dopamine is that it is chemically similar to cocaine. And serotonin is chemically similar to LSD and to the drug ecstasy. And so by taking illegal or non-prescribed drugs, such as cocaine or LSD, these drugs can actually affect the balance of neurotransmitters in your body because they are so similar to those neurotransmitters. And so that's another reason why it's detrimental to take street drugs. Now, how neurotransmitters influence us is extremely important in terms of how they work. You have the agonists and the antagonists. Agonists are molecules that may be similar enough to a neurotransmitter to bind to its receptor site and mimic its effects. Morphine is an example of this. So when you take the drug morphine, it mimics other neurotransmitters and it binds to the receptor site on the dendrites and mimics the effect of other neurotransmitters. Antagonists, on the other hand, bind to receptors, but they block a neurotransmitter's functioning, or they might be enough like the neurotransmitter itself to occupy its receptor site and block its effects. And an example of this is Botox. So when you take Botox, it binds to the receptor sites and it actually paralyzes the muscles. And so you have Botox, they put Botox in, say, if they put it in a woman or a man's forehead, it will bind to the receptor sites and prevent the muscles from contracting. So it's very interesting. And this goes into a little more detail on that. So you see at the top, it shows how a neurotransmitter binds to the receptor site, much like a key in a lock, to a receiving neuron. In an agonist, it mimics that neurotransmitter. So you see it's not exactly the perfect fit, but it's similar enough in structure that it mimics the effects on the receiving neuron. And so morphine, they're showing in this example, is close enough to endorphins that when you take morphine, it gives you a similar effect in the body as an endorphin. And then an antagonist here, they are talking about curare, which is a type of poison that some Native Americans used to put on the tip of their arrows. and it paralyzes its victims by blocking acetylcholine receptors involved in muscle movement. So again, you can see in this illustration that it's not a perfect fit like a key, but it does actually cover it enough that it blocks acetylcholine from being able to cross that synaptic gap and bind to that receptor site, and therefore it causes paralysis. The nervous system itself, so that's the nerves, but on a bigger scale, so we looked at a micro level, let's go back to a macro level. On a bigger scale, the nervous system is divided. It has many layers. So in this case, you can see in this illustration, this flow chart, how the nervous system is structured. So you have the nervous system has the central nervous system, which communicates with the body's sensory receptors, muscles, and glands via the peripheral nervous system. And then the peripheral nervous system is broken down into autonomic and somatic. And then the autonomic system is further broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the central nervous system is basically the brain and the spinal cord, the center part of the body. The peripheral nervous system is going to be everything that flows out of that. Okay? So think of the central nervous system as the center of your body, and the peripheral things, like your toes, your fingers and toes, are on the periphery of your body. So that's one way you can remember the peripheral nervous system. And then, of course, out of all of this is the backbone, or your nerves. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, as I said before, you have the somatic and you have the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system enables voluntary control over skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system controls our glands and the muscles of our internal organs, influencing functions such as glandular activity. The autonomic nervous system is the key player for emotions. And so it's interesting. It also deals with stress and health. It governs our fight or flight response. So when we're feeling challenged or under some sort of stress, it's the autonomic nervous system that kicks in. However, the autonomic nervous system may be consciously overridden. So it's not like you're controlled by this. You do have some means of overriding its response. And then the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arouses and expends energy. So if you're challenged or alarmed, it will accelerate your heartbeat, raise your blood sugar, etc. When the stress, however, decreases or the threat goes away, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and it seeks to conserve energy, and so it calms you by doing opposite things like decreasing your heartbeat. And this shows some of that. This is a breakdown between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, the arousing and the calming. It shows the different things that it does. Some ways to remember those different aspects of the nervous system, as I said before, the central nervous system is at the center of your body. The peripheral nervous system extends, the nerves extend out to things like the fingers and toes, which lie in the periphery of your body. The somatic nervous system, soma, is the body, and it's like the body's voluntary actions are done by choice. So these are the things you have control over. Just like volunteer work, it is a choice. And then the autonomic nervous system sounds a lot like automatic. So think of that as the body's automatic actions like breathing, heartbeat, etc. Now if we look at the central nervous system more closely, you see that it's the brain and the spinal cord. Now inside the central nervous system, the brain's neurons cluster into work groups called neural networks. And the neurons, the expression here is neurons that fire together, wire together. And so they create short, fast connections. And then when you learn something and learning occurs, feedback will then strengthen these connections. For example, learning to play an instrument. When you learn to play an instrument, every time you learn, the connections in these neural networks are strengthened and another layer of neurons is added, and that learning is strengthened. It's really kind of fascinating. Now, the spinal cord. The spinal cord is an information highway, basically, that connects the peripheral nervous system to the brain. And neural pathways governing our reflexes will show us how the spinal cord works. So it's really interesting. So we often think about reflexes. This is really kind of fascinating when you think about how our reflexes work in terms of the spinal cord. This is what we call a reflex arc, this illustration here. Interneurons are actually what make reflexes happen. Those cells in the spinal cord process motor responses quickly to protect our body from harm. So it's pretty interesting. So what you can see here is you have the sensory neuron and the motor neurons and the interneurons and how they interact. So in this case, and this is a hand withdrawal reflex. So if you were a kid and you wanted to touch the tip of a burning candle, okay, your skin receptors are going to let your sensory neurons know that it's feeling something hot, harm. Those sensory neurons are then going to go to the spinal cord where they're going to be processed. And then what's going to happen is through the interneuron, the message is going to go out to a motor neuron that's going to say, oh gosh, jerk your hand away to keep from getting burned. Okay? So it's interesting because you actually can bypass your brain even being involved in a reflex. So it's pretty fascinating in that sense. One of the ways to think about sensory and motor neurons is that sensory neurons connect to the spinal cord in the back, so on your dorsal side. Motor neurons connect in the front of your body, in the front of the spinal cord. So what's fascinating with spinal cord injuries is that it's possible to lose feeling in the lower portion of your body in a spinal cord injury, but still be able to move that part of the body. So we often think, oh, I have spinal cord injury, I can't move my legs. That's not necessarily true. You might not be able to feel your legs, but you may still be able to move them unless the spinal cord is completely severed. And so in something called a reflex arc, specifically, sensory info will enter the body through receptor cells, like these skin receptors that you see on this hand. That information is then transmitted by sensory neurons to the brain, that then processes this sensory information and decides what to do. And then what it decides is sent via motor neurons out. Motor neurons receive commands from the brain about what to do. Now, it's processed in interneurons in the brain or the spinal cord. But in the case of reflexes, a lot of reflexes don't go to the brain at all. Now, if you actually burned yourself, then the sensory neurons would transmit pain to the brain. The brain would discover that in the interneurons, and then it would go back out to a motor neuron. But you could have the reflex of sensing that you could be in danger, going all the way to your spinal cord and the motor neuron jerking your hand away without the brain ever registering it. Actually, the brain would register it, but it would register it as secondary. It can be done without the brain's involvement.